this beautiful night or evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. And we have a beautiful group of people here and a beautiful conversation. And we're going to talk today about, Tiala, can you help me mute people when enter the room? Thank you. We're going to talk today about value accounting. We're going to talk about the action spectrum. We're going to talk about currencies and flows and visibility of those flows. And we're going to talk about, we're going to see where it's very improvisational, conversational type today, but we're definitely going through some topics that are important for us to cover, which I named some of them. But also the MetaCapital Framework. So we're going to learn about it, about the different dimensions it has, from types of capital and impact and the metrics. And we're going to be able to intersect some questions and answers in it. And we're going to present a bit about decentralization and distributed architectures. And we're going to then share what is coming next in MetaCapital and Holo that are news we want to share with all of you that we're excited about. So that's our flow for today. I'm gonna put some polls in the chat just to get some idea of general knowledge about some topics, and I'm gonna share the results with you. So you're gonna see some questions in your window, and we want to have a couple of minutes. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That gives us some idea of where should we frame our conversations. And then let's do the next one. Mm-hmm. So for such a small group, people that are already designing some sort of value accounting systems is high. Let me share with you guys. And let's do this last one. I'm so happy people know about it. And it's so cool. And it's taking steps further for humanity and our evolution. Watching the evolutionary arrow just go zoom into decentralization. And I see that people say, yes, I do. Okay, very good. That gives us a sense as presenters, a little bit about where people are at. Welcome, everyone that just joined the Zoom room with us. So today, as I shared some of the flow, and I want to introduce Jean and Sean. For me, they're my beautiful co-creators, both of them. I love them so much. That is so exciting for me to have both of them in a room at the same time. It's already a blast. So I hope you guys have a good time, because I'm already having a good time with that happening. It's just like the magic of what we when we cross time and space, what is that we can do and being here together. So I'm going to ask, what can I tell about them? I think I'm going to introduce them So Sean, for me, is not only a brilliant, beautiful soul, but he is a true practitioner of what he knows. He's not only have a deep knowledge, but embodied knowledge in many, many fields. He's very well known in the integral world. He's a writer, he's an author, he's a facilitator, and he's a very bright spirit and soul. And he's the creator of the MetaCapital Framework. And Jean is a beautiful co-creator of all, really, guys, it's like when you think about thrivability, this is your woman. If you think about what is next from sustainability, if you think what is next from regenerativity, you can think about thriving. So if you want to thrive, you really want to ask Jean, because she has a lot of knowledge in that realm, and she is knowing how to apply that within a project that we both play together in, which is Holo. And I want to introduce her work and talk about Action Spectrum, which is something that is also part of thrivability, but it's taking its own life. So she'll be introducing about that today. She is also the lead of the IC of Holo. So we'll be talking about some of decentralization and distributed architectures and how does that match with value accounting. So anyways, welcome, Jean. Thank you for being here today with us. And I also have here some other people from the MetaCapital team, Iskela and Shanti and Jeff Clearwater, and they're going to be helping us. And if you have questions in the chat, you can always ask that, and I'll be able to monitor them, and they'll help me to engage with you guys. So welcome of all of you today. Okay, so Sean, I want to ask the first question, and I know this is going to be kind of a flow in between question and answers and very conversational, as we know, and we're prepared for that. And I have my first question about value accounting. So I want to listen from you. Your definition of value accounting, what is it?
Yeah. For me, value accounting is creating, an accounting system or a tracking system or some kind of way of, including multiple forms of value. So not just financial value, but things like psychological value, social value, natural value, right? So there's a lot of different models out there about different kinds of value. But so for me, value accounting is kind of an expanded accounting system that actually includes the values that most of us find most important and that we actually want to include in our business and organizational, initiatives and structures. And so it's, finding a way to kind of take things that we generally think are invisible and making them visible, right? And so, including that value in some form. So let me just tell a quick story that I think kind of gets to the heart of how I think about this. One of the clients that I'm working with is a multinational company based in Australia and a few other places globally. And I'm working with them, and they're including the MetaCapital Framework in what they're doing. And I said, what are the kinds of things customers have said to you are valuable about the products and services that you're providing? And so they sent me this document that they had created last year that had about 30 statements on it through a survey and through interviews that they'd done with clients that listed all the different types of value that the customers had indicated they were getting from the products and services of this client. So I took those statements and I began dropping them into the different types of capital that are included in the MetaCapital Framework, and very quickly was surprised and not surprised to see that there were 5 to 7 statements that basically went in all 10 forms of capital, right? So in other words, the customers were saying they were getting value from this client across all 10 categories. And yet, when you talk to the client and how they frame the value they bring to the customer, they primarily emphasize safety, which is kind of like health capital, primarily emphasize knowledge because they deal in different data streams. They primarily emphasize cost savings, right? So they have like these 3 categories that they emphasize, as the core values that they bring to their clients, their customers, but they're leaving all this value on the table. Like they're actually delivering more value to the customer than they realize. And so for me, value accounting is being able to not leave value on the table, and for customers and projects to be more aware of the many types of value they provide the people engaged with what they're doing, and to find a holistic and integrative way to kind of capture that and track that, so that we can be more aware of the multiple kinds of value that are exchanged in a business context or a community context, an organizational context. So let me stop there, and that kind of gives an initial sense of kind of my orientation to this important question.
Yes, Sean, thank you. I also heard in times you talking about value accounting being about intimacy. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, great. Thank you for highlighting that. One of the reasons I fell in love with integral theory and have largely devoted most of the last 20 years to understanding integral theory and how to apply it and create integrative systems is, for me, it's a way of honoring the intimacy that I want to cultivate with reality. And so when we include more of the types of value that are individuals and organizations and the kinds of exchanges that are happening, it actually supports and honors the various qualities of intimacy that occurs. So like in this example of these clients and my client, this organization, the client was having more intimacy with, the customers were having more intimacy with, this organization than the organization realized. Because the organization was highlighting kind of these 3 or 4 main categories that they felt was their primary kind of business model. But they actually were delivering more value than that. And so the customers were having more intimacy because they were getting spiritual value, psychological value, knowledge value, natural value, right? So the intimacy is about using value accounting to track and understand these different qualities of connection, because each of these types of value is a way of connecting with each other, connecting with products and services, connecting with organizations. So by expanding our frame of what capitalism is and what capital is and what value is, for me, it allows us to have the heartfelt relationships that are naturally wanting to occur in these spaces, and often already are occurring in the spaces, but we've adopted a set of, accounting practices that kind of reduce all of that intimacy to a few types of categories. And those categories are not fully representative of the full human engagement that's actually occurring in these spaces. So I like to use intimacy as a frame to kind of help us realize that it's not just about numbers. It's not just about making what's invisible visible or making psychological or cultural realities kind of more accessible. It's about cultivating intimacy and really generating intimacy and the kind of human relationality that so many of us are hungry to see more fully supported in organizations and businesses.
Thank you, Sean. I've been with you, working for a while with you, and I know that's also about revealing better stories and how to create those stories. But now I want to give the space to Jean, and I want to listen from you, Jean, with the same question. What for you is value accounting, and how has that manifested in your own life and work?
So I come at it from a little bit of a different angle, which is having worked in philanthropy and social entrepreneurship and wanting to be able to account for the different things that are happening in ways that are not always rewarded financially or visible financially. And so I love the MetaCapital Framework for kind of building out some of the more dimensionality of that. But from a philanthropic angle, when we're looking at, is this creating an impact? How do we know that there's an impact there? And then can we reward organizations that are helping to create that impact? That's a little bit more of the background that I'm coming to the question from, and the complexity of trying to tell that story well.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot to say around impact and what that impact really, really means. And you touched slightly around social impact, and you touch entrepreneurship as well. So what do you feel in this moment that I know we're like in this entrepreneurship together? What would be flows of value that you see, that you would love to see visible, and that might not be visible now, and what could be done about it?
So in the project that we're working in now, there's so many people from different backgrounds, and being able to make visible the knowledge of community and community needs would, I think, help facilitate a better tool design and use for communities. So that would be one way, is that knowledge / cultural awareness that each of us bring to the table.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a good moment for me to ask you, Sean, about impact. And I don't know if you want to, maybe I can screen share myself the MetaCapital Framework, or if you want to screen share it yourself, I can do that. But I would love you to speak a bit about impact, and then we can have a small conversation about that together.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I will screen share in just a moment, but let me say a few things before I do that. The tagline of MetaIntegral is "Be Impact," and we arrived at that after several years of kind of soul searching as to what are we about, what are we trying to do, as a company and organization supporting integral practitioners around the world through leadership and consulting services. And I put a big emphasis on embodiment. So for me, be impact was like a perfect phrase, because it's like, actually be the embodiment of the impact that you're wanting to create in the world, and act in a way that really brings that impact forward. So it's kind of, the Gandhi phrase with the Nike "just do it" energy of kind of like be that impact. And the MetaCapital Framework, which is also called the Meta-Impact Framework, and actually started out primarily as the Meta-Impact Framework, emerged out of the foundation, the MetaIntegral Foundation. So it emerged out of a philanthropic context, because nonprofits, and especially ones that are philanthropic in their orientation, are being asked to track their impact in a way now that has not always been the case. And so many of them are scrambling, like, how do we do this? Because they've always been mission driven, that's one of the kind of hallmarks of many nonprofits, but they haven't always tracked their impact, and in the ways that can be, and in some cases should be. And so we were looking at that in the context of the grants we were giving. So we were giving like $50,000 or $60,000 in grants to like 10, 12 different projects. We're like, how do we track the impact in an integral way, and what does impact mean? And so I started realizing that even though there's a lot of energy around social impact, when I would look at what they were using to talk about the impact and the different kinds of impact, I often felt like more could be said. And I realized that there are actually different kinds of impact, and that the old school kind of version of impact is kind of behavioral change or systems change, and that was hard for nonprofits, because that was trafficking in a form of impact that didn't always line up with their mission-driven principles and orientation. So like they wanted to track different kinds of impact than what a lot of the kind of traditional KPIs and metrics are kind of organized and designed for. And so it's a bit of a crisis, or was, and still is something that's kind of interesting to see happening out there. So I started looking at, how do we expand the notion of impact? Like, there must be different types of impact. So that was one of the key starting points for the MetaCapital Framework, was building a framework that did a better job of identifying different types of impact, so that we could have a different conversation about impact. And then after using that framework to track the impact that these integral grants were having in these projects, then the focus on the capitals came later. So let me share my screen with you just to give a little more, graphic expression to what we came up with. So this is just on the MetaCapital website. And so there's 4 types of impact, and these are connected to, integral theory's 4 quadrants, for those of you who are familiar with Ken Wilber's work in that context. But so up at in what's called the upper right of the 4 quadrants is what I call clear impact. This is change in stakeholder performance, right? So often skill assessments, analytics, observation tools, traditional KPIs are often used to track this kind of impact. So this is impact that you can just kind of almost visually see, right? Or it's very clear, it's kind of obvious in some sense. So it's a very common form of impact. In addition to that, there's what I call high impact. And this is change in a stakeholder system, right? So this is actually finding kind of those leverage points in the system that if you impact those, you're going to have a distributed impact across the whole system, right? So, where are the key interventions that can have the biggest transformation across the system in multiple ways, right? So, environmental impact assessments, financial impact assessments, input indicators, and then again, a lot of KPIs, have this kind of systemic orientation. So clear and high impact tend to be the form of impact that I see discussed most of the time when we're talking about impact or even social impact. Or they'll talk about social impact, but then they'll often try to draw on metrics associated with these two types of impact in my experience. But I felt that there are these other kinds of impact, what I call wide impact, which is change in stakeholder relationship, right? So actually transforming the nature of the relationship. Generating trust, generating coherence in a community, creating a more positive relationship. So 360s, relationship mapping, interviews, focus groups, social impact assessments, can do a good job of tracking this type of impact. And then lastly, there's deep impact, which is the change in hearts and minds, change in stakeholder experience, right? So, there's self-evaluations, psychometric satisfaction surveys, happiness inventories, among many other ways of tracking this kind of impact. So with these 4 types of impact, clear, high, deep, and wide, my experience has been in the context of working with the MetaImpact or MetaCapital Framework, is it's allowed me to have a more nuanced conversation with organizations and project leaders around, okay, which of these 4 kinds of impact are the types of impact you're most wanting to have, right? And nonprofits often want to have deep impact and wide impact, and kind of the more traditional for-profits, in my experience, are more focused on clear impact and high impact, right? And they're starting to want to have deep and wide impact, and likewise, nonprofits are tending to realize the value of also having clear and high impact, right? So there's different metrics associated with each type of impact, and there's different traditions of documentation and tracking and making visible. So it's been really helpful in the spaces where I've been applying this to have this kind of expanded cartography of impact, so we can talk about the different kinds of impact, because then that allows us to be more clear about what types of measurements are appropriate, what kind of time frames are appropriate, because deep and wide impact sometimes takes more time than clear and high impact, right? So there's just a lot of interesting layers to the conversation that can be possible by expanding, to these different types of impact.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. That's a lot of information, and it's beautiful information. I like seeing the application of it, like when you think about organizations and they have their values, their beautiful values written on the wall, but until they don't go into the action or the behavior part, they won't have clear impact. Right? So they might have some realization, like when people say, go ahead and go like, okay, I shouldn't be consuming as much. I should be more sustainable. But if, until the behavior is shown, until the action takes place, from deep impact to clear impact, there is a step, and they're all interrelated. So I would want to ask Jean, because I would like the perspective from thrivability. So perhaps I would love for people to listen to your description of thrivability, and how does it connect with other known words as sustainability and regenerativity, and then we'll connect from there.
So thrivability is simply the ability to thrive. There's a beautiful chart somewhere on the internet that I made that's, I'm sorry, I don't have it at hand now, that goes through like survival, sustainability, I think it's regenerativity or resilience, and then thrivability, and kind of charts the difference between them. And so for me, thrivability is in the space of the anti-fragile, right? It's a system that when it's perturbed actually learns and gets better, where resilience to me has more about or even regenerativity has more about the bounce back, but not the get better in the act of bouncing back. We might find that a subtle difference. The other thing that I feel about thrivability is it calls us to our greatness. So many of these things are pushing back against the things that we don't want to have. They're an away from activity, and thrivability invites us to ask, what is it that we want to move toward? Thank you, Fernanda. Exactly. So thrivability's motto is game on. It's about life giving rise to life. The idea being to be more thrivable, you contribute more value than you consume. Not all value being consumable, but the giving more back. Yeah. So the generativity, the creativity, to me is one of the core distinguishing things about thrivability. So Fernanda, what was your second question? I got lost in answering that one.
No, that's a great, it's also connected to my second question, which was the difference between sustainability and thrivability. And, so here you have the different stages, right? From survival, sustainable, resilient, and thrivable. But since we were talking about impact, I want to hear from you. What is impact? How do you see impact in the space of thrivability?
So, I had this thing against quadrants, which might not be a popular thing to say in an integral space, but I tend to use a lot of circles. And so the action spectrum covers some of the same ground, but the framework is on a different axis. And so I think there's a lot of complementarity that might be useful and resonant for many people here. So it thinks about things in terms of system science and starts with simple systems. And so the spheres, concentric circles, go out from control, guide, and then nurture being the largest sphere. I mean, then there's chaos outside of that. But the idea being that the simple systems you can control. And so, if your social impact has to do with the homeless, your control is, I fed somebody dinner tonight, right? You did a specific action and you saw an immediate result. Guide tends to be, yes, thank you. Guide tends to be this collaboration that you have with somebody else. So we started a soup kitchen so that we could feed the homeless. And now we can count how many people are coming. Is it because my friend? Is it because of the food that's cooked there? Is it because of the community they get? It becomes harder to attribute why that's working, but you can still see that people are getting fed at this shelter. Nurture is a complex adaptive level of the system. And so it's more about planting seeds. You start to hear metaphors about harvesting, cultivating, the kind of farmer words instead of control words or mechanical words. And so that's what are the things that we can do to really transform homelessness in our world? And it might be a whole set of programs around education and community development, the way we're organizing our public spaces. There's a whole set of things that can all be interoperating there, and it becomes hard to say which thing did which shift. And so the story of attribution comes from the people who are impacted. And so hearing their stories saying, well, it was because so-and-so connected me to this project, or because I was able to move through this process, that I was able to, escape homelessness, for example. So I think that you could apply those three layers to almost all of the quadrants that Sean has described, and that might enrich the space in which we're talking about and looking at impact and assessment for value accounting there.
Wonderful. I love all multiple dimensions on top of all the other dimensions. And that's how the conversation with Sean and I started, right? With the different levels of wealth and how did it connect to MetaCapital Framework. And different levels of wealth is a work of MetaCurrency. And I won't go into it right now, but it just mentions how there is some value that is visible, another value that is measurable, another value that is just nameable, like love and relationships, and other types of value like health that you can measure and you can see. So perhaps if we go, I mean, and that inspired a lot of the MetaCapital framework. That was pre-MetaCapital framework, when we were talking about the levels of wealth. And so Sean, if you would want to connect, I don't know if the next level of the MetaCapital framework to introduce would be probably the 10 types of capital, so that was the visibility of that.
Yeah, okay. So, let me screen share. So, here's these kind of 4 areas of impact that we were just talking about. And Fernanda did a nice job of, kind of pointing out that they're very interrelated. And sometimes a single intervention will have 2 or 3 types of impact. Or, maybe a program will want to focus on one kind of impact, but then they realize in having deep impact, they're also having clear impact and some wide impact, right? So as we started working with these 4 types of impact and kind of, looking at the grants we were giving, the kinds of impact that were happening in those projects, and kind of the really interesting relationships and differences, I started to get more interested in some of the multi-capital models that were out there, and started studying them to see what are some patterns that are happening in these, forms of these models that have like 3 or 4 types of capital, often like human capital, social capital, psychological capital, or natural capital. And one thing is, I was amazed that there were so many different models out there being used by lots of different people and businesses and organizations. And so I kind of brought together, about 16 of them that I'd come across, because I was very interested in like, what's the relationship between these types of impact and these different forms of capital or different forms of value. And so as I started playing with it, I put together this model that has these 10 forms of capital. And these are forms of capital, and actually I'll switch to a different diagram. It's bigger. And all right, so there we go. I think you can see them all. Just move that. All right. And so after I went through all these different multi-capital models and started to do some integral pattern recognition to see, what are the key forms of capital that should be included in a more integrative model, I landed on these 10. And then I started to notice that different forms of capital were associated with different types of impact. And so, in clear impact, for instance, you have health capital, so physical well-being, and human capital, so kind of skills and capacity and training. Right? Whereas in high impact, you measure high impact through these 3 primary forms of capital or value. So manufactured value, financial value, natural value. And then likewise with wide impact, that's typically or can be measured primarily through social value and cultural value. Social impact, or social capital tends to focus on like trust and, that individuals have with each other, and kind of what's the network of trust, and is trust high or low, between people. Whereas cultural capital tends to look more at like coherence within like a community or among people, within like a department or an organization, and could even include kind of brand loyalty, right? So I found it interesting that these forms of value or capital tended to be connected to different types of impact. And then the last one here is with deep impact, can be measured through knowledge capital, psychological capital, and spiritual capital. So in the MetaCapital or MetaImpact framework, the multiple forms of capital become kind of the concrete way by which you can then measure and track the different types of impact, deep, clear, high, and wide. one of the more complex layers of this, which I won't go into other than to just mention it kind of in passing, is you see these concentric circles, 1P, 2P, 3P, which is short for first person, second person, and third person, or what could be said subjective, intersubjective, and objective or interobjective. So these are different types of metrics that you can use to measure these forms of capital that then give you a sense of these types of impact. And what's different here than what's generally found in Wilber's work, Wilber's 4 quadrants, the right-hand side is usually thought of as the quantitative aspects, and the left-hand side, the green and the blue, are thought of as the qualitative. For me, I combine it in a different way, where the first and second person, this subjective and intersubjective methodologies are the qualitative, and the third person are the quantitative. So in this sense, there are quantitative and qualitative measurements for all 10 capitals. And so these concentric circles are a reminder for people using this model that, there are first, second, and third person ways of measuring, health capital or natural capital and so forth. So that, again, creates that kind of multidimensionality that, Fern was highlighting. And to me, this is one of the strengths, of this model, is because I feel we need we need to include more dimensions in how we approach value accounting and impact and kind of redefine or reimagine capital. So let me just stop there, because I know that's a lot of content, and see where the energy is.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have some questions. The first question from Mark is, less and less value is in manufacturing. Where does service sector fall in the graph? Not all service is financial. And I think that's for you, and you're muted, Sean.
Yeah, thank you. So manufacturing, we'd have to hear more about kind of what you have in mind when you're using that term, because it could be used to point to kind of different layers. But my sense of what you're asking is that in many cases there's manufactured capital, which is assets, typically like buildings you own, equipment you own, land, offices, so it's kind of like these kind of tangible assets. But there is more and more conversation about intangible assets, but generally manufactured capital is talking about the tangible assets. But even in that context, you can actually talk about all 10 capitals around certain assets. So there's a fractal nature to this. It's not a set of boxes that you put certain things in one capital or in one box or one type of impact. The model's wanting to highlight the multidimensionality of these realities and how they permeate each other and how they flex and flow into one another. So the model's more wanting to engender a kind of integrative thinking and kind of an orientation that kind of can even look at financial capital. Like there's a psychological dimension to that. There's a cultural and social dimension. There's an environmental dimension. There's a human skills and capacity dimension, right? So you can very quickly kind of find all 10 types of value in the context of even financial capital, right? But when we come to talk about how do we track these things, how we track and measure and make visible these types of value, then kind of the pinwheel, model with, the 10 different types, can be useful to, just organize your thinking and your strategy for, and your selection of methodologies. So in a sense, I would say manufacturing can fall across the whole chart depending on which aspects you're wanting to highlight or explore or measure. So you could say, we're manufacturing, this product. How are we cultivating psychological value and psychological capital through that process, right? How are we increasing trust between, members in the supply chain? So how is social capital being increased, right? That's just maybe one quick example of kind of the dynamic nature between these distinctions.
And Keala asks, food grown for the purpose of market would be seen as manufactured product produce cultivated capital. Is that accurate?
I think so, because often, manufactured capital is talking about inventory, like kind of, what's your inventory? And so if your inventory is, food, if that's what you're producing and manufacturing, then yeah, it does. And then this is a good point of how, food and agricultural kind of products and services, also connect to natural capital and human capital very quickly, and social and cultural capital, right? Because if you're, basically disintegrating a community through, big agricultural practices and interventions, and it's kind of tearing apart the fabric of the community, it's like there might be high manufactured capital because you're producing a lot of lettuce, but you're going about it in a way that's destroying the cultural capital, and trust is down, so social capital is down. There's fear and anxiety, so psychological capital is down, right? So they can start to see the interrelationships between, like, how do we, tend to multiple forms of value and capital in any given scenario.
Thank you, Sean. Is there more questions? Because we're gonna keep moving into other topics, but I wanna make sure that we take a breath, and if there's other questions that need to be asked right now, we could have a space for that. And you can use your microphone, you don't have to just necessarily write. So I think we can keep moving, and let me, I don't know why is this in the screen, Joe, but I'm gonna just stop that.
It's like a teaser of what's to come.
It's like a teaser of what's to come. Yes, thank you. So let me, it's just like, that's funny. I never had that happen to me before, someone screen sharing. So if there's no more questions, I'm gonna continue with the next part of the conversation, and that's about value and value flows. And when a little bit of story here is that when Sean and I began our conversation, when we just met, and Jeff Clearwater, we were the three of us, we were talking about currencies. And MetaCurrency has and holochain has a very particular way of seeing currencies. And we see it as current C, which is a way to make visible, to enable, or to shape a flow. And so we use that in a very broad sense. Only with those words you can start seeing that it's not about money, but it's beyond money. So it's about things like, for example, USDA organics that make visible a certain flow of production that happened over time, or PhD degrees that help us to see an education flow that happened over time. And so that's the way we've been using currencies. So for us in MetaCurrency and holochain and Holo, which is like projects that are kind of navigating the space together. MetaCurrency, holochain, and Holo were born from MetaCurrency. We are beyond the crypto, more than cryptocurrency space, which are for transacting value for products and services. So the conversation today, because it's about value accounting and it's beyond money, it's around how do we make visible in these times, what are the right architectures to make these flows visible. There's different case studies that we have had in our field, like for example, communities really care about tracking their flows of contribution. They want to be able to track what people do that help the vision move forward. Not just 40 hours invested in the garden, but that created a specific result or created a specific type of impact. There's organizations like Omakery working on tracking different types of performance-based contribution, and then being able to use that with a currency that helps them bring liquidity to a project and is based upon IP. So there's different ways on how to do that now, and the potential has definitely amplified with the coming of distributed architectures like the blockchain, and in our case with holochain. So my question right now for Jean is, Jean, how do you see that we can collectively capture and use the information, the value information?
Right. So I want to start actually answering that question by saying, like, why? What do I want as an outcome from doing that work? So having been in circles talking about transformational philanthropy, right? It's about not just, mediating today's concerns, but actually transforming society or current practices to some other levels of being and doing together. So what are the things that'll get us there? And what I found so consistently is that that's not stuff that you have immediate control over. They're big cultural shifts. There's, multidimensional community engagement that it's hard to motivate philanthropically, the ecosystem shifting. And so looking at how do we develop systems that allow all the inputs about, let's think about a community and maybe they want better education and better food and more community engagement, like trying to arrange that financially and then track the indicators is quite hard because you often have multiple contributors to solving those issues. So how do you create the collaborations between organizations that address those concerns in ways that amplify each other? And so I've been looking at how do you create like a marketplace whereby people can say, these are the outcomes, these are activities that we think would lead to those outcomes. And so having people do actions and get acknowledged for those actions that contribute to the collective output and transformational shift. And so the trick is most of the organizations that are working on this want to own and control their information, right? That's their body of knowledge value that they've created. They don't want to share it. And so creating a marketplace by which they're motivated to share that and that financial flows reflect the collaboration, I think is something that I've been working towards. And what I find with holochain is that we could be having everybody keep track of the individual bits of information of actions, indicators, values and flows in a way that generates up into a collective system instead of it being behind a closed door where we can't access it. And so the breaking down the structure into a decentralized and distributed network allows for that collective view and also the collective activity that we can reward to be much more integrated and collectively aware in those efforts towards transformational change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Yes. It's for me, as working in the space of wanting to make those flows visible, I've been waiting for a technology like holochain that would help us to be able to track all these different flows of accounting. And we could do it through different types of currencies and different types of designs. Depends on what is that we're wanting to see, what is that we want to highlight, what is important for that community. So there is a big breadth of possibilities. And the way I see the interaction with MetaCapital is that MetaCapital offers people a framework, and as I said, to tell better stories, to see multidimensional ways of value, and then can help them focus on, oh wow, what if in my application I would want to focus on human capital? What would be the indicators? What would be the types of metrics? How could I capture that information, that data, in a way that is that doesn't require a lot of humans entering their data and exhausting themselves and then not happening. So I have big questions on regards of how will we design these types of applications. Yeah. There's some applications that I know you've been starting to work with, Sean, and would you want to talk about that?
Yeah, let me say a few things about visibility and the importance of visibility in this space. I've had several conversations with Zach Stein, who some of you know of, and around this topic of, if you really want to change reality, one way to change reality is to change what you measure and how you measure it, right? And so he often explores this in the context of education, right? And how different educational systems, measure certain skills or capacities of students, and how, to try and create a more holistic educational environment, you have to change the testing system and change what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. And you see this dynamic happening in business too, right? With how nonprofits are trying to be more business-like by tracking their measure, and measuring their impact. And businesses are trying to be more mission-driven and kind of purpose-oriented. And then how, so they're kind of both asking, how can we measure, and what do we measure, and how do we measure it? And so there's different strategies for visibility, right? There's visual strategies, there's narrative strategies, there's numerical strategies, right? Using just numbers, right? There's performance strategies. So there's a lot of different strategies to make these different realities visible, these different values visible, right? And so I think part of what's interesting is how do we have an accounting system that uses kind of multiple strategies of visibility, right? And what does that look like? Or how do we translate the visibility that's garnered in an accounting tracking system and then tell more interesting stories, with that visibility? When you look at the therapeutic traditions and the contemplative traditions, one of the core principles of transformation in both contexts is the process of taking something that's subject, something that's kind of behind you, you can't really see, and you bring it around and you make it an object of awareness. So this is Robert Kegan's work with subject to object dynamics. And so meditations support this, therapy supports this, coaching supports this. A lot of the transformational arts involve in some form taking something you're not seeing very clearly and bringing it around so you can see it more clearly. So the same thing happens around visibility and these different capitals and these different types of value. By making them visible, right, and using different strategies for visibility, it brings these realities, these multiple layers and these dimensions into awareness, collective awareness, so that then we can operate on it, we can work with it, we can respond to it, right? And so when it becomes visible, then visibility engenders transformational feedback loops. We start acting differently, we start saying things differently, we start building different systems, we start creating different cultural spaces, right? So there's a very powerful, social transformational driver here by making these different values visible. That in itself is psychoactive, social active, it starts to change the systems and the people and the relationships and the behaviors and the experiences associated with it. So I think there's something really beautiful and powerful about this idea of currency, right? And taking different currencies, taking different values and flows and making them visible and having different strategies to do that. So it engenders, transformation across these different categories. And in my experience is there's nothing in the left-hand capitals, right? Or in Wilber's left-hand quadrants, to use that frame, that cannot be made visible. We often think of those are the invisible realities, psychological, emotional, existential, spiritual, cultural, social, relational, all that's invisible. It's only invisible from a particular, perspective. There's a lot of it that's very visible, right? But there's different ways of talking about it and including the visibility, right? The visibility of those realities is a different kind of visibility than, on the right-hand side with behaviors and natural ecosystems, which have a particular kind of visibility. So there's different types of visibility. So a lot of the work that I do with clients is kind of helping them to actually shift their mental models around visibility and what is visibility and how do we make psychological or emotional realities that are occurring in the organization visible. Right? Having just a minute of silence at the beginning of business meetings starts to make certain things visible. So that's a lack of sound, right? That's a 1 minute lack of sound at the beginning of each business meeting that you have throughout the week. That's making something visible, right? So the shifting our ideas about visibility, I think, has been really fascinating in this context because there's a lot of ways to make things visible. Right. And so I think when we're building value accounting systems, this is an area I'm really interested in. how do we engage different notions of visibility in that context? So it's not just about numbers, right, and tracking numbers, right? So when you have an annual report, one of the things that I've done with some clients is they don't just report the numbers of, we had, we adopted this practice of having 1 minute of silence at the beginning of our meetings, and so over the last 6 months, we've had, X number of meetings, let's say 75 meetings with 1 minute of silence at the beginning. So that's 75 minutes of silence throughout the last 6 months in the context of our regular meetings. Well, that number 75 is one way of making that visible. Like, it communicates something, and it's interesting. Another way of making it visible is having some pictures of people sitting around the table with their eyes closed during that minute of silence. Another way of making it visible is asking people who have participated in that over the last 6 months to talk about what has been the impact of starting to include that 1 minute of silence during your meetings. How has the quality of the conversation changed? How has attention and somatic awareness changed? And having a narrative description of, like, oh, we talked to 40 people in our organization who have practiced this 1 minute of silence, and here are the 7 reoccurring themes around how that minute of silence has had impact on them and the meetings and the organization. So that makes it visible, right? So maybe there's charts and graphics, and visual symbols you can use to make it visible. There's numbers you can use. There's photographs. There's narrative stories, more interesting stories. And then you include that in the annual report or on a blog, or, or you share that with other people in the organization so they become aware of what, these folks are doing over in this part of the organization. Then they're inspired to not just do a minute of silence, but to also stand up and stretch, use the body, So I think there's a lot of creative, simple ways that we can talk about visibility and the practice of it, and how might we then adjust our accounting practices and our value accounting systems to be more responsive to these layers of visibility.
Thank you. There's 2 pieces I want to bring, and that was spectacular. I really like it because it brings all of our full selves. So many people think about accounting as numbers and just ordinal things, when you're talking about a full breadth of possibilities. And I heard Jeff in other moments to speak about this and speak about commodification and value. So I want to bring him in because I like when he tells that part of the story. So Jeff, if you're game for that.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, for me, it's, if I may, with this crowd, be a little hippie, but it's about making things psychedelic for me. It's like we live in a psychedelic world. We live in a world of relationships. We live in a world of multi-dimensional value in this incredible weaving of flows of energy. The ecosystem, the biosphere, is a juicy flow of multiple flows all weaving together. And I think capitalism has tended to systematically commodify things. And I sometimes like to think of counting and our wanting to count everything as almost a collective neuroses. I mean, it's, and if we could get back into more of a like Sean was saying with the simple example of a meditation at the beginning, I think that if we can look at all of our relationships to value, to all the subjects and objects of value that we have relationship to, and think about how can we decommodify that? How can we make it part of our community, not that sense of other? So for me, that's what what we're really talking about here is a whole shift in consciousness that kind of spirals back out into decommodification of everything rather than the commodification of everything. So that's just my piece. Thank you.
Yes, so that's a piece I wanted to be present, the piece of more of our humanity, more of bringing ourselves and seeing ourselves as those multidimensional beings. We can see that in the personal level, we can see that in the collective level, to be able to make things visible in organizations. Sometimes we would need to sit down and talk about it. Sometimes we'll be able to create what I dream about in collective intelligence, which we have this word called holopticism, which is would mean that it's like a football field. You are in a football field, you're a player, you can see what every player is doing, and because you can see what every player is doing, you will be able to position yourself in the best place to be able to help the team move forward. Now, in a wider level, if we have holopticism, for example, about the things we buy, where do they come from, where the resources are, what kind of communities, were there, people, little children in China creating that object, or was that an enterprise organization that respects their employees, that gives them really good contributions, that compensation for their efforts and for their energy? Where does it go when I finished using it? If we would have that visibility, we would be able to make some more intelligent choices than the ones that we're able to do right now. So part of the work that we want to be able to bring with holochain and Holo is to be able to make those flows visible. And part of what happens is that a lot of our data, like what if Facebook only allows us to use our data? Can you imagine the amount of information and beautiful data that we could see that would that would help us move the evolution of consciousness? But we don't, because we don't own it, because it's not ours. We cannot use it. We cannot create anything with it, because basically we sell it. We give it away. We don't sell it. We give it away, and then they sell it, and even sell it in a flat way. I know that another passion of Jean is also collective intelligence. So I would like to know if there's something that you want to connect around this topic.
Yes, I would love to. And I love your idea of the journey of something, like where did it come from and how, whose hands touch it. And given like IoT technology and some of the other things that we've bundled together, the being able to see the full value stream for the whole life of any given object, I think is going to be really incredible. The downside to me of some of this is the amount of information. Right? It's like the collective data could be huge. How are we going to sort through that data to make it knowledge, much less wisdom? And so like I get excited about all the information that could be possible. But then I wonder about how we create currencies and good indicators so that we could use that information, that data, in ways that produce genuine wisdom. And I fall back some to the currency model when I think about how to do that well. You mentioned college degree as a form of currency, but it's paired with the grades that you get, the credits that you get, for the classes that you take, and then the whole degree. And so designing the systems in a way that allow the vast amount of information to be surfaced, and then using collective intelligence to start to shape, and currencies to shape how that ends up being presented, so that any individual is not overwhelmed by the degree of information that we're receiving, I think is part of the big work that we need to be doing ahead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It also reminds me that holopticism is not about having visibility or access to everything, but the right signals, right? As we know, it's like, wait, we don't have holopticism. No, you have access to everything. Yeah, but that doesn't mean the right signal that will help me move forward what I need to move forward. And so there's a big conversation about how do we create the right signals for that kind of coherence. And this is it's a very unique and personal experience in regards to, we're so different from one another. So the kind of signals that are meaningful to me might not be the kind of signals that are meaningful to someone else. So thank you. Jeff says, yes, I agree. Yeah.
The good news about that is our computer systems don't have the information overload that we do. We just build bigger computer systems to pay attention to more. And so you're just putting a filter on that reality so that you see more of the things that you want to see, right? So thank God the computer systems can remember it all.
Yes, and I also see that more forms of visualization are being made possible. I mean, we have friends in the space of holochain that are creating a trust graph or are creating visibility for virtual reality, right? You go into this world and suddenly you can be able to listen to some data, and then you'll be able to make other data kind of visible because of colors, or, so the amount of creativity that we'll be able to see once that our data is ours is unthinkable. I mean, I have always wished to have that for the communities movement, like a map where you don't see the communities, you kind of see a forest. And then it's meaningful to you because you see the size of the trees in the forest. And that means that this community, because it's a big tree, it's been there for many years versus a small tree, that means it's new. Or, fish in a pond where the fish swimming low means something, where the fish swimming high means something else, or the bubbles coming in up and down. I mean, there's a lot of creativity on how our brains receive information that are beyond pie charts. Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, one thought that comes up in this context that came up in the MetaCapital course is this notion of expressive capacity. And it feels that, for me, the value of the MetaCapital framework is not in terms of its kind of elegance or the symmetry or the categories in and of themselves. It's an attempt to give us more expressive capacity around different kinds of impact, different types of bottom lines, different types of value, different ways of measuring that, value and those capitals, so that we have more expressive capacity, so we can actually have a more sophisticated and nuanced conversation around a topic that is so important. Like if we're going to talk about impact, like there's few topics that are more important in my mind than the impact that our businesses and our projects and initiatives are having. But if we have a set of distinctions that kind of fall short of enabling us to have the meaningful conversations that we would do well to have by understanding some of this dimensionality, right? So I think, and this is also in terms of kind of the visibility piece, right? It's like, how do we increase our expressive capacity? How do we use value accounting and holochain and similar kind of platforms to increase our expressive capacity so that we can have different types of conversations than what we're capable of having now, because we don't have as many useful distinctions. And this is one way of dealing with the information overload, right? Is being thoughtful about the distinctions we use and the quality of expressive capacity that we have, so that we can navigate that information overload. Because in some cases, we have more information than what our expressive capacity allows us to navigate. So one way of dealing with the overload of information is increasing our expressive capacity so that we can be better discriminators of that information and sort out the noise from the signal. And I'm seeing in the
yes,
in the
there's
chat,
a question.
Yeah, about, say something about the tension between new awareness in the face of prevailing systemic norms that may be outside of the control of the individual or even organization. Yeah, that's a very real reality. And I see this as a coach when I help change a person's heart and mind and their behaviors, but then they're in a system that has built-in antibodies against all of those transformations, or like changing a team or some part of an organization, and then it's embedded in a system that is, antithetical to those changes. I'm not sure. It's a hard dynamic. I think, these points we're making about, useful distinctions and, and expressive capacity helps kind of name the dynamic and work with it. One thing that I've noticed that I think does speak to this question is you can't just make a change in one type of impact or one type of value or capital. It's like you usually have to be working in 3 or 4 of those domains kind of concurrently, kind of in terms of like reinforcements and kind of helping the system to embody those shifts and those changes, right? So if you just like introduce a new communication protocol into an organization, right, but you don't change people's capacity for presence, and you don't change the reporting style that they're using, right, and you don't create a schedule that allows them to have time to use that new protocol of communication, then you're sending in this new protocol of communication and it's not going to take root because you haven't made shifts in the hearts and minds, you haven't made the right shifts in the behaviors, and you haven't made the right shifts in the system, organizational systems. So often you have to kind of be tending to those different dimensions, those different realities, so that these interventions can take, get sticky and have some traction. So over and over again, I see interventions, psychological interventions, behavioral interventions, systems interventions, or cultural interventions that fall short and don't take shape because you're not tending to the interventions or shifts that need to occur in those other domains. And so this is where the expressive capacity, I think, helps us, and the visibility starts to help us see those dynamics and then work on multiple fronts concurrently to help the kind of embodied transformation that we're wanting to see to take root.
I'm giving a breath here for us to process all that has been said and to just receive and practice that right now. Thank you. I am curious, Sean, if I think that from the we went through the impact, through types of impact, and we touched on the types of capital, and you touched a bit about the metrics, but if you could go a little bit more in depth with the metrics, I think it would move the conversation forward.
Yeah. So like that example I gave about the minute of silence, right? When I began talking in that little segment, the first thing I said is, if you want to change reality, change what you measure and how you measure it, right? So in that example, we're changing reality because we're measuring the minute of silence, right? Which, a lot of organizations don't include that. So, and then by measuring that and then, measuring it in multiple ways, right? In terms of the significant impact that people report through self-report, through, the amount of times it's happened over a duration, right? By, photographs or, other things. It's like we're using multiple ways to measure it, right? So this is one aspect, that to really include multidimensionality, to include these multiple forms of value and capital, it's useful to have multiple forms of measurement, even of the same thing, right? So here's a minute of silence, but we're measuring it in terms of numbers, we're measuring it in terms of narrative, we're measuring it in terms of, photographic documentation, right? Because that multidimensional approach to measurement then allows our embodied awareness to relate to the many aspects of the phenomenon. If we just measure something in one dimension, ideally, or not ideally, but typically like through numbers, it only reveals that dimension. And then often it doesn't tell us much, right? Or it tells us something specific, but maybe not necessarily what we're wanting or needing. So I think one aspect of this is an embrace of a creativity around measurement, right? And, and so a lot of times when I work with companies and teams, there's this concern of, I haven't been trained in qualitative, measurements or methodologies, or I don't have a background in statistics. I don't know much about quantitative measurement. My orientation to that is, if an organization has that, we can leverage that. But that often gets in the way. Like, I want to democratize measurement. Like, I want to use forms of measurement that anyone can use, right? So like in that example of the minute of silence, you don't have to have any research training, right, to do those forms of measurement that I talked about. So, part of the value in the MetaCapital Framework is helping us shift our understanding of types of measurement, how we can measure, like the formal versus informal, and really making it a lot easier so that anyone can, measure any of the capitals in a first, second, or third person format. So I had talked about before this idea of there being first, second, and third person forms of measurement. So let me just give an example of that, because I think it adds an important layer to the discussion. If we take, and this is an example I use regularly. So if we take psychological capital, and we say we want to grow psychological capital, we want to increase psychological capital so that there's more hope, more resiliency, more optimism, more capacity, more maturity, right? So there's different ways to define psychological capital, those being some more common ones. We say we want to increase it, then we can take on first-person practices to increase it, second-person practices, and third-person practices. So a first-person practice would be some kind of inquiry process, right? Journaling or reflection, and so doing a subjective practice that, allows you to grow psychological capital, allows you to reflect on your thinking patterns, right? Making those visible to yourself. So again, we come back to this idea of visibility, right? That the practice, in a sense, that first-person subjective practice is to make the contents of your embodied experience more visible to yourself, right? And that increases psychological capital typically. And then you can measure it by having, the journals that people, keep in that, and then looking for the themes in the journal, right? So rereading the journals and pulling out the themes and coding and right. So there's some very informal ways you could include that data or pull out key kind of remarks that are summative in some sense, or kind of capture the essence of, the results of that practice. In terms of second person, typically in an organization, you would use coaching or some form of mentorship to support the growth of psychological capital. So I get called in a lot to be a coach to individuals, executives, and founders, basically to increase their emotional intelligence, their interpersonal skillfulness, and how they integrate that with their big brains, right? Because they often are really smart, but they're total assholes. And so they're needing to work on their emotional dimension and their interpersonal dimension and integrate that with their cognitive capacity. Or maybe they're feeling overwhelmed with the amount of complexity they're facing, and I'm helping them to expand their cognitive capacity to hold more complexity, and then integrating, that, emotional, interpersonal, and cognitive dimensions together. And so that's the practice, the growth practice for increasing psychological capital in individuals, is a coaching program. And then having, the ways you measure the results of that, right? So when people on your team start saying things about how you've changed, that's one form of measurement. They're reflecting back to you that you're showing up differently. Like you're not as much of a jerk as you used to be, or you have better active listening skills, and they're noticing that. So often, usually about the fourth or fifth or sixth session with someone, if the work is going well, then they start reporting to me the things that people around them are saying as they observe the behavior and interpersonal and emotional changes that are occurring. So again, that's making it visible to the client that they're actually making progress, right? Because people are saying different things, right? So you can also track and make visible the second person transformations. And then third person way of, testing and supporting the growth of psychological capital would be through psychometrics typically, right? So like the sense completion test, or Lectica's work with the LDMA, or personality assessments, Factor 5 or Enneagram, or, Myers-Briggs, right? And again, that's making visible certain structures of consciousness, either what are called vertical structures, if we're talking about levels of consciousness, or horizontal structures if we're talking about personality dynamics or object relation dynamics, right? And so you're making those visible, and then because they become visible, then you can work with them in a different way. And then you can do pre and post assessments with that, right? So you can grow psychological capital through first person practices like self-inquiry, second person practices such as coaching or mentoring, and third person practices such as certain types of assessments and metrics, right? And then those can inform, how you're measuring it and what you're measuring. And that's true, that example I gave is true for all 10 forms of capital, right? So there's a first, second, and third person way of growing financial capital. So a first person way of growing financial capital is looking at your money issues, right? Doing inquiry around what's your relationship to money? What's your biography around money, right? And, so as one example of how that's a form of financial capital. Right now, we think of financial capital primarily in terms of cash, debt, and equity, lines of credit. I'm suggesting we expand that view of capital, so that financial capital, so that we're not just talking about that third person objective or inner objective aspect of capital, but we're talking about the shadow of money. And what's our relationship, our own relationship, shadow to money, and then also interpersonally, second person aspects of that. What's our relationship with money and other people and power dynamics around money, right? So that financial capital becomes an expanded form of capital in this model that includes the shadow, right? And because if we're not dealing with that, I think we should be dealing with that. It's like it's an important part of the equation, right? So not just to let financial capital just be the numbers, but there's these emotional and interpersonal dimensions of it that are important. So you could think of the different examples with the other capitals and what are first, second, and third person practices that grow that capital or that value, and then what are the associated forms of metrics that can be connected to that, so you can make it visible and track it. And again, keep in mind, when I say measure, I don't mean formal research-based approaches, which can be used. I'm talking about the kinds of measurements that we use all the time informally and organizations often are using. And it's just becoming aware of that and then including that in the visibility process and in the reporting process.
Wow, yeah. So that's a fullness of multidimensionals that starts with oneself, right? So there's no that excuse like somebody else can apply, but it really talks about how we can apply it in our own lives and how we can start enacting in ourselves to tell a better story of who we are, and what we're doing in life and what is the impact we want to create. And there's a question in the chat, and I think I want you to answer it, Jean, because you speak about having a proposal that went to one, and says, Gavin asks, transformational philanthropy and other sources and systemic leverage points, are there any multi-billion-dollar deep wealth MetaCapital impact funds being developed that could also integrate the new kinds of cryptocurrencies that holochain team are working on? That's a question. So, and Jean is like ready.
I am. Because it's so much what I've wanted to work on. And here we had these opportunities. So we had a firm that works with one of those organizations, or collections of organizations, come to us and ask us to put together a proposal. They're looking at the Millennium Development Goals and asking, how do we reach these goals? So let's just take even just one of them. Let's take clean water and sanitation, for example. How are we going to address this goal globally? And it's just so much bigger than any one organization, even if it's got very deep philanthropic pockets to do. And so we worked on like, what would it be to create a marketplace by which various players could come together? And when thinking about that, I looked at one of my favorite examples is the measles initiative brought together like the Red Cross and the CDC and several other organizations, where each one provided what they are uniquely able to do to contribute to a collective project. And so trying to become the matchmaker, even if it ends up being less facilitated and more open, by which people can be contributing at the individual and collective layers towards reaching a goal like that, and have that become visible at the many dimensions in which we've spoken about in a reasonably short time period. So yes, we've worked on it. And the big benefit that holochain would have to that is the ability to track the information at such a granular layer. And so being able to be at a well, or know if a bar of soap had been opened, or like all these like fine little grains of information, and having those even work in rural areas would be able to help facilitate that system. And then the other thing with Holo is that it's designed for microtransactions. So usually the computational cost of doing transactions in a cryptocurrency can be prohibitive for use, but because of the effectiveness of the currency on Holo, it's actually so small that all those things could be like tiny, tiny rewards for all the tiny, tiny actions across the globe. So it's possible.
And more inquiries are coming through, and part of the MetaCapital team is wanting to go into that inquiry. Who doesn't want to fund the funds with like deep pockets where we can start structuring or be able to direct those incredible financial flows into initiatives that can create the most impact in the world. And again, that's not like, if one initiative, I don't think it's possible to cover just one type of capital. They just don't see it. What is your perspective, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like, I really want to speak against the idea of the capitals being these different boxes that we put things in, because most everything has value in 2 to 5 different types of capital, right? If not all 10. And so it's more about like, how do we support our multidimensional thinking and feeling so that we can see these overlapping dynamics and relationships? Because I think the current capitalist system, and Jeff was speaking to this, the commodification dynamics has it's dumbed our thinking down, where it's hard to think multidimensionally, because so much of the systems we're embedded in are always having us or reminding us to think in this kind of unilateral way, and to kind of get it down to, it can only go in one box, right? But it's like, if something happens in an organization that's useful, it's like usually there's psychological capital, financial capital, cultural capital, it's like there's, so like, how do we have an accounting system that can acknowledge those ways in which certain realities show up in multiple forms of capital, right? And that we're not having to choose and go, okay, I can only put this impact in either the psychological capital box or the social capital box. But it's like, no, how do we actually code it in a way that the layer of that psychological capital goes into the psychological, domain, and is tracked there, and the social capital goes in, right? So that then we can find what are the activities that actually produce value in 4, 5, 7 different domains of capital, right? Opposed to, and though maybe in some cases it is appropriate that something just gives to 1 or 2 types of capital, but this is the kind of expressive capacity and the multidimensional thinking that I'm wanting to encourage and learn from and engage with others around, so that we can really rethink the whole notion of accounting from kind of a linear process to a fractal, a holonic, a meshwork, and ecological, like there's different, like what are the different design parameters that we have to keep in mind, to kind of overcome the linearity of our tendencies towards linearity. Does that speak to your prompt, Fernanda? Okay.
Yes, that definitely speaks to my prompt. And so I'm also watching for the time, I do a lot of multitasking when I'm in these sessions, also tracking private conversations and sensing. And I have my own flows here going on, guys. So be patient with me. So there is a question from Justin Robinson that says, speaking of the Sustainable Development Goals, it would seem that they are mostly chasing high, clear impact, with the exception of quality education. I wonder how the MetaCapital Framework would look at the 17 goals as a whole.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree. I do think the majority of them are focused on clear and high. And I think that kind of exposes our kind of cultural and organizational tendency to try and think in those terms. That being said, what you can do is you can take all those goals and you can look at how all 10 capitals are important to each or most of those goals, right? So you can take kind of a multi-capital orientation to each of the goals. Or you can also do a first, second, and third person approach to the measurement and the making visible the impact and results of those goals. So I think, and this is often the case, it's like I get handed kind of old paradigm realities, and then how do I bring my multidimensional thinking up to that? So I never shy away from working with something like those goals, even though they're largely kind of couched in high and clear impact, because there's other ways I can engage them to bring out the multidimensionality. I don't need them to redo the goals so that there's kind of an equal amount in, the covering the different types of impact. It's like I can work with what they've given me, but then I can kind of in the back door kind of bring in kind of a holistic, integrative, multidimensional approach that allows us to bring in those other layers, because they're always there, right? Just like with the example of the organization that thought they were selling their products and services based on 3 types of value, but the customers were actually saying, no, there's 10 types of value you're delivering. So usually the 10 types of capital are there. You just have to be creative and aware. And this is where the expressive capacity comes in, because then it allows us to be able to spot it and point it out, and then include it in our reports, in our measurement protocols, in our story, and how we tell a different story. So yeah, and this is part of like how we interface with the current realities, and then kind of, it's like in the Zen dojo, right? The Zen master uses the energy of the ego to overcome the ego, right? So finds ways of aligning with the ego in order to dismantle the ego. So similarly, like how do we find ways to align with the status quo, right? And then kind of do that Aikido move or that Zen move, so that we bring in the fullness, the full human, relational, emotional, spiritual, aspects, in spite of the fact that there's this tendency towards clear and high impact as kind of the primary lens from which to try and make meaning out of everything. But it's so sad because it's hard to make a lot of meaning out of clear and high impact. The meaning generally really comes in with the deep and wide impact. But if you start to understand how, the clear and high impact actually is connected to wide and deep impact, then you can discover the meaning in that. But we often kind of in that commodification, we rip out the signals of meaning that are otherwise there in the clear and high impact domains. And then we end up scratching our head, kind of, not knowing how to kind of rehabilitate the meaningful narrative that actually is there, but it's been obscured because of the commodification.
Yeah, I was going to give that with the part of the collective on the difference, because you said select what you measure and then how you measure it. And when we think about how we use gross national product to become the measure of progress from different countries, it's just outrageous. It's just so flat. It just doesn't tell the story. It just doesn't help us in any possible way. So what is your, and I know you lived in Bhutan and you were in the gross national happiness type of aspect of things. So would you want to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, just briefly, it's like I now, given what I'm doing in terms of the multi-capital work and so forth, I find it very interesting that the first academic paper that I ever published was in the Journal of Bhutan Studies, when I wrote an article for them basically proposing how they might measure gross national happiness using an integrative approach. Now, this was at a time before gross national happiness started having their kind of annual conferences and really trying to figure out how to operationalize it. This was at a time when they had this idea of gross national happiness and everyone loved it, but they kind of didn't know what to do with it. And then since then, they've really done great work around kind of figuring out how to make it be a real viable orientation. And in that context, again, I talked about first-person approaches, second-person approaches, and third-person approaches, so like how they can measure happiness, through self-report, through focus groups, through interviews, through anthropological modalities, through demographic and statistical modalities. So again, it was trying to highlight that, we need to measure it in multiple ways, at multiple scales, and through, qualitative and quantitative, right? And that there are lots of ways to measure happiness. And measuring happiness doesn't necessarily reduce happiness to a commodification. That is a danger if you're approaching it from this kind of unilateral, linear orientation that we often kind of have lurking on the sides. But once you have a more embodied, integrative orientation, then that's much less the danger, right? So I think there's a lot to be learned from Bhutan. I think they've really modeled and pioneered a way of measuring the quote invisibles that include multiple forms of value along the lines of what we've been talking about today. and so they've been a real inspiration globally. And yeah, that was one of my first papers. So it's like, it's like interesting how it's like you move away from something and then you end up coming back to it. So little did I know in writing that paper that, I would be sitting here on December, 8th, talking with you all about this.
Well, in that same realm of other types of flows and other types of measurements, I want to ask Jean about, I know we have had some conversations about the invisible flows and the feminine, and how inside of organizations, not necessarily the type of feminine flows are the ones that become visible, and then they tend to get lost. And what happens there, and what is possible?
Oh, sorry. Muted. This is one of those things where I feel like I have a lot more work to do. But I can say that I've been frustrated for some time about the measures inherently being masculine. And so the type of indicator, there's like a valuing right now of elbowing in, like the aggressive step forward and be heard, which to me is not a very a feminine way of presencing, to listening and sensing. And so if we're not making visible the ways to notice whether the feminine is present, or we're trying to measure it and look for indicators of the masculine, like let's say creativity is being judged by whether somebody won an award or not, that's not a very good indicator of whether creativity was present, if you ask me. It's a masculine indicator of competition, and not a like, was there variety? Was there companionship? Was there, like other ways of looking at creativity? So I'm noticing a lot around it, but I'm not sure that I've come up with lots of ways to improve it yet. I just keep seeing these indicators that feel much more masculine focused. Maybe you have something that you would like to share, Farananda. What do you see?
I see a lot of good intentions on people creating this type of value accounting systems and saying how we make this more visible, more feminine flows visible, like when, and this is not only women, to be precise, it's more like those things that are becoming like when somebody enters the room and it just creates something because she or he enters the room and it creates a space of receptivity. Or when we slow down and Sean was saying, and then we see what happens. Or when, we sit in circle, or when we, so I have the intention to be keep holding space for those more visible values to be able to come and be surfaced within the space of projects. Like I see we give a lot of credit to the software engineer or the people driving the business, but what about the persons that have been holding a project for years, that bring their social capital, their love, because they have that purpose in their heart, and they've been clearly moving it forward, maybe not as visible. So I have those questions in my mind, and I'm hopeful that we're able to bring that into different types of applications, because as it's been said here, it's not about developing only one MetaCapital tracker, but it's about how do we help with MetaCapital Framework and other frameworks to make visible within different applications, different types of capital. And in this case, the feminine, the psychological, the spiritual. And I don't know, what is your perspective on that, Sean?
Yeah, I think this is such an important area. And, I think a lot of the measurements are masculine in part because they tend to be quantitative and, based in numbers. And there's also, in some ways, just a kind of masculine orientation to the notion of measurement. And so I think there does need to be a deep conversation around that, and like, how do we include the feminine, and also, not just that layer, but also, the Western orientation versus indigenous, right? There's some really interesting work around indigenous methodologies, that are really distinct from kind of Western orientations to methods and measurements and metrics. So the feminine and the indigenous, and there's probably some other categories, like we can talk about post-colonial orientations to measurement, which sometimes is coupled with the indigenous. But yeah, I think we need to really open up the conversation around measurement and metrics and create more creativity and more possibility. And this kind of taps into what I was saying about wanting to democratize measurement, right? So it's not just, you don't just have to have a background in, qualitative or quantitative research in order to have a voice at the table. But like, we're always measuring things all the time, in informal ways. So like, how do we tap into that aspect in a creative way and talk about, the feminine ways in which we're measuring, the more indigenous, kind of can be around like ritual or symbols or ceremony or, so I think there's a lot that can be explored here. So I'm really glad you raised this issue, Jean, because, I'm just really eager to bring that more fully into the conversation because it feels really necessary. Looks like Shanti had a comment about this. One way of looking at it is the masculine archetype is focused on agency and the feminine archetype is focused on communion, thus bringing a focus on metrics that allow us to see an enhanced connection, and communion brings the feminine in. So yeah, I think, those are the inquiries we want to be having collectively, so that our value accounting is not just another vehicle of an uber masculinity, but our value accounting is actually supporting the integration of the masculine and the feminine and making a lot of room for the feminine.
And then Alex contributed inclusiveness, breath, non-measurement, like silence is part of music. We have 15 minutes and we have some topics to go into. Sean, people are asking what is next, and Jean, people are asking what is next. So if each of you can offer, what are you working on? How can people contribute? What is next?
Oh, great. You want to go first, Jean?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So in the very short term, like the next 2 months, I'm project managing the ICO for Holo. And so I'm super excited about building out community for that, and taking on some writing projects to be exploring that story. And so engagement around the conversation of what matters in building Holo and holochain. We're launching a Holo Chats series, which will allow anybody who's using the tag HoloChat plus the theme to contribute to that conversation and grow our collective intelligence around something like, we'll have a conversation on the sharing economy or personal data or decentralization. So that's a way to participate with me in the next 8 weeks. Thereafter, I would love to be focusing more on and how are we using holochain to service communities, so that things like like my vision of a marketplace by which people can be contributing to a collective transformational activity can come into being. So that's more of a longer term way to engage, is to talk about what can we be doing in those, how can we use the MetaCapital Framework to think through that system design. It would be a great way to continue the conversation with me there.
Great. Yeah, very exciting. Yeah, that's cool. And I look forward to connecting with you, Jean, more, just so you and I can synergize and explore ways to support each other. There's a few things happening in my space that are invitations for all of you. One is we're just about to announce the confirmed dates for a 5-day seminar in person in Iceland, and Arne, who was on with us for the first hour, who lives in Iceland and is a colleague of mine, is working with me and a woman named Claudia to put this together. And we've just connected with the Open University in Reykjavik. That's kind of their ongoing, continuing education, adult learning kind of arm of the university. So we're going to be doing that in the second week of April, it looks like, from like the 9th to the 10th, rather the 9th to the 14th or 13th, so 5 days, Monday through Friday. But part of what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to create a conversation in Iceland, and not just be an international seminar that kind of goes there, does our thing, and then leaves. So the Friday before the seminar starts, we're going to have a open lecture to the thought leaders of Iceland about multi-capital systems and multiple bottom lines, and how that might support some of the progressive thinking in Iceland, right? And they're also very into cryptocurrency, so I think there's some interesting links there. So we're going to give a talk on that Friday, then we're going to have a 5-day seminar, and part of that seminar is going to be having everyone in the seminar working on a presentation that we're going to give to the Icelandic community on either that Friday night, the last day of the seminar, or Saturday. So it kind of bookends the event. And the idea is, like, we want to take these ideas that we've been exploring here with all of you today, and we're wanting to create that kind of conversation with, the business leaders and academics and community, leaders in Iceland to see, what's possible with this kind of multidimensional value thinking, right? And value accounting and cryptocurrency, and just see what emerges from that space. So we're hoping to announce, the dates in the coming days, and then the registration page will be up, in a week or two at the most. So, let us know if you're interested, or just, stay tuned. Another piece is, Fernanda and I, hosted a 10 or 12 week MetaCapital masterclass last year, and we're wanting to do that again. And so we're going to be clarifying the dates of that. Last time it sold out with 50 people, which was awesome and kind of a surprise. But I think it just indicates there's a lot of interest in these conversations and inquiries. And then we're the MetaCapital Tracker team, which was introduced at the beginning of this event, are also working on creating a proposal and possibly some apps, in the context of holochain, maybe even doing a hackathon around this. So I think we don't know what those points of entry will be for all of you, but we're very eager, as we clarify that for ourselves, to be able to invite you into participating in that space in one way or another. So those are at least three emerging ways of playing in this big sandbox with us. And Fernanda, you have a few things too, I think, to add to the list.
I know, I do. So this is the second webinar that I do one week after the other. And next week, we're going to have another one with Jean-Francois Noubel. And he is going to speak about, he calls it From the Homo sapiens to the Holo sapiens. So he is a collective intelligence expert. So he'll be going from the evolution of collective intelligence, all from what he calls tribal collective intelligence, all the way to holomidal, and how and what are the kinds of capacities that people need to build to be able to become a full Holo sapiens. So that's going to be really great. We're going to announce it in all of our channels, in Holo and holochain and MetaIntegral, and as well as our personal channels. So we welcome you to that. We do have a hackathon in Ashland coming. It's going to be probably the first one in the West Coast since we launched, and that's going to be 5th, 6th, and 7th of January. And since we're going to have some time with Art Brock as well, and with Sean, we're kind of going like, oh, maybe we do have some holding space on those hackathon days for people that want to bring into life value accounting. And Jonathan already said, I'm interested. I want to go in. So I know that there will be people tuning in, and the idea is to be birthing these applications, because with Holo, we got the body, right? We're building our collective body. This is our new nervous system, one that is truly ours, our data commons. So what is next is to be able to birth that which we are holding precious, because we want to be able to coordinate our actions, to communicate with others in a way that is different, that respects more our sovereignty, and that builds our economy, gets mine, but grows ours and grows the commons. So that is going to be the constant invitation you're going to be listening from us in many angles to be able to fulfill that. And I'm sure some of those will call your heart. And yes, so if you are into continuing with us, the journey, we also have a Mattermost public channel. And if Robert Best is here, if you could place a link in the Mattermost, that would be wonderful, of our public channel. So that would be that. I think that's it for now. And team, help me out if there's anything left. But yeah, there's a lot.
Do you
what
want
is not happening, right?
a little more about the partnership with MetaCapital and Holo, and do we have time for the video?
Oh, yes. Let's do that. Wonderful idea. Thank you. So let's do the video, and then we share about the partnership. Yeah. So let's see.
We use the internet to make plans, connect, work, and play together. The internet hosts our lives. So why do we entrust it to organizations who typically don't have our best interests at heart? Most of our communications flow through centralized web servers where corporations control our online experience. They collect our information, limit our access to it, and then sell it to advertisers. And because a centralized internet concentrates power, it's vulnerable. It can be censored, hacked, and manipulated. The internet is broken. But what if no one stood between you and your data, or dictated how you connect with friends, family, and community? If it were free from central control, it would vastly expand humanity's potential for creativity, and it would change the whole game. We know this world is possible, which is why we created Holo. Holo is a community rebuilding the internet by and for the users. Rather than running information through centralized corporate servers like Amazon and Google, Holo offers peer-to-peer web applications that replace the middleman with the spare computing power from our own devices. This creates a cloud run by users like you and me.
Holo gives you back control of your data and online relationships. This isn't just file hosting. This is distributed crypto apps, small and large, all the way up to Facebook scale. But we can't launch this alone. We need you to run a slice of this new net. And we don't want venture capital to take control of this space. That's why we've built all this without it. And now we're asking you and your friends to step up, get a hosting box, and take back the internet.
Simply get a Holo hosting box. Enable yourself and others to access distributed apps through a web browser, and get paid in our secure cryptocurrency, Holo Fuel. Holo Fuel can then be used to pay hosts for data storage and processing. Plus, it makes in-app purchases and micropayments easy. Apps available on Holo are built on holochain, an alternative to blockchain technology that is massively faster, more energy efficient, more scalable, and 10,000 times cheaper. Holochain architecture is so lightweight that you can operate a full Facebook-scale node from a single smartphone. That's great news for developers who can build fast applications that scale organically. The easiest way to help launch Holo and participate in its growth is to purchase a Holoport, a pre-configured computer we've optimized to host crypto apps. Just plug it in, connect it to the internet, and start earning. We've teamed up with a world-class hardware supplier to produce 3 different Holoports, each with a different capacity for earning Holo Fuel. Choose the Holo port that works best for you and quickly earn back the cost of your purchase. If you claim one of the first 1,000, you'll become a founding member. At Holo, we're building the future of the internet, one that doesn't impose or exploit, but empowers.
Join our community. Run Holo. Earn crypto. Together, we can build a better internet.
Oh, this is gonna start something I don't want to start. Stop. Yay. Yes, thank you. So I believe we can, and it's the right time to do it. And we wanted to mention last of what is the partnership relationship. And what I want to mention is that something that not a lot of people know, which is when the project began, we did a little bit of a commons space, or as Jeff Clearwater calls it, a small platform, participatory commons space, where MetaIntegral and Scepter and MetaCurrency and Village Lab came together, and as well Galvanizer, and we said, what can we do together? And we fundraised together, and we activated different projects. And holochain is part of that, and MetaCapital is part of that, and Village Lab is part of that. And so the next step for us is continue building participatory commons, building regenerative enterprises, getting together and saying, how do we create organization ecosystems where we can see all these different wealth together and create wealth pools where everybody can benefit. And so we're doing that small experiment experience, and we've really been doing what Sean has mentioned as stewarding each other's core gifts. Sean, do you want to say more?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of the point of like the notion of distributing. It's like, how do we steward each other's unique gifts, and how do we support the best of us to come forward, right? And both individually, but also in terms of strategic partnerships, right? And creating an ecosystem of organizations and initiatives that are helping the other organizations and initiatives to bring their unique gift forward, right? And so I think that's, for me, what's exciting, because it's grounded in just like this core intention of human connection and really enabling the best parts of us to shine, individually, collectively, organizationally, project-wise. So, we've been working together for many years now. It seems it's amazing to reflect on the journey we've been on in some of those initial meetings. Fern, you and Jeff were here in this office that I'm in now. But yeah, there's a lot of exciting things happening, and we want to find other ways to create entry points and connective tissue with all the things that you all are doing as well. Because as Brock Arthur points out in the video, it's like we got to do this together, right? And so that's the joy of it for me, is finding those relationalities that where there's a mutual appreciation and a mutual amplification of the goodness that we're all bringing into the world, and how do we increase that? So
I hope. May it be so. And thank you for being part of this conversation. If you're here, it's probably because it tickles your soul, resonates with you. So I'm very, very grateful for all of you to be here. Jean, if there's any other last closure words you would like to say?
Gratitude. Thank you for all caring and showing up and being fantastic listeners, and for being intrigued about how we can co-create the future.
Yes, thank you. I think we can stop the recording. And